right, this church is a little small, but I guess we'll use the microphones anyways. Welcome, everybody. We're just going to start with a brief prayer, so you could just bow your head and close your eyes. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this beautiful day we had. Thank you for allowing everyone to travel here safely. We ask for your guidance tonight as we just soak in the knowledge of what zoning is. Dear Lord, just have your hand on this meeting, and in your name we pray, amen. So how it's kind of going to work, we have Matthew Brown, if you want to stand up. We have Buford, he's on his team, and Selena. Matthew can do more introductions, but they are Baldwin County Planning and Zoning Commission. Myself, I'm Elizabeth Wilson. I'm the one who initiated this process. I've met a lot of y'all along the way. I guess how we'll do it first is, Matthew, you can just come up and kind of explain what zoning is, do your speech, and when it comes time for questions, y'all could either just stand up and ask them, or there is a microphone that's on in the back. If we need to use that, that's on and ready. Any questions?
All right. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I do want to kind of officially introduce the team members that we have here today. We have Buford King. He's the Deputy Planning Director. We have Selena Boykin. She's the Senior Planner for our Planning and Zoning Department, and then I serve as the Planning Director. And we also have with us today, and I think it's important to point this out, is Mr. Bill Booher, who serves on our Planning Commission. And he's sitting in the back there. And what's great about this is that Mr. Booher serves on our Planning Commission on a temporary 3-year term as a result of the new Planning District 19 that was just recently formed when zoning came in for a new district near the Point Clear area. So it's our most recent district, so he's a new member on our Planning Commission. He just went through this process as a citizen, just like those of you who are in here today. So a great resource as a result. All right, first of all, I want to talk about what zoning is not. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the process that we're in right now to get zoning in place, and then we'll do questions. And I'm going to, out of respect for your time, I'm going to move things along quickly, but I know that zoning is almost like a foreign language to a lot of folks. And I like to use this illustration. How many of y'all, maybe when you were young, or maybe when your kids were young, can recall a time when kind of everybody in the neighborhood got together and they would play backyard baseball or backyard football or something along those lines? And, everybody just had a great time. You didn't have to hire referees. You didn't have to have an official rule book. Everybody kind of just knew the community rules, right? Everybody lived together. They played together. They understood how to get along. Well, I'm going to throw a little monkey wrench into the illustration. Suddenly some new kid moves into the neighborhood, and all the community kids are getting together and they're playing their backyard sports, and the new kid walks up and he says, "You know what, y'all are playing that wrong. Y'all are supposed to play it this way." And he's coming in, and suddenly he's trying to change the game that y'all have played in your community for a long time. Well, suddenly everybody's kind of in disarray. This outsider's coming in, they're changing things. So everybody says, "You know what, we're going to pass a simple little rule book that says this is how our community plays this game." And that's what zoning is. Now, I was born in a small town of 100 people in southern Iowa, a farming community. My dad was a pastor of a little church there. He now pastors a church here in Baldwin County. I moved down here when I was a teenager. And I grew up in a family that was very pro-property rights and anti-zoning, because we had this notion of zoning, that zoning was government control, right? That's kind of what the feeling of what zoning is. And maybe that is the case in other places. We're here to talk about Alabama and Baldwin County specifically. In Baldwin County, zoning is a very unique process. And I don't even like to use the word zoning. Let's just think of the rule book, okay? The rule book that governs who can build an apartment complex in your neighborhood. We call those rules zoning, but take aside and put all that baggage aside, and let's just think of this rule book. that governs that. In Baldwin County, or in Alabama, in Baldwin County, Alabama, zoning is a citizen-led process. So I'm a county employee, Buford's a county employee, Selena's a county employee. We're here tonight as guests. We're here on behalf of the county commission, but not because the county commission is asking y'all to consider zoning. It's because you as citizens or citizens in your community have gotten together and said, we think we need a rule book that tells some developer or sets out some rules for a developer or really any member of the community who wants to bring some type of use change into our community. So those citizens got together, and now there's going to be an election taking place, and we're going to talk more about the process later. So point number one I want to make is that zoning is a citizen-led process in Baldwin County. There's something really beautiful about that, because if you look at this map here, all the yellow areas are zoned areas, and all the white areas, and they have a shade of yellow too, but the whitish areas are unzoned areas. And what's interesting about this map is you'll notice that around most of the cities, the area is zoned, with one major exception, and that's Fairhope. One of the fastest growing areas in Baldwin County does not have zoning outside of its corporate limits. So again, we're talking about what zoning is. It's a citizen-led process. It sets these rules to determine how a developer, or again, any landowner, what they can do in terms of changing the use that exists on their property. So the next thing about what zoning is, once it's in place, it's more than anything, it's a compatibility check. So we have people come to our planning commission meetings all the time, and there's a new subdivision coming in an unzoned area. And I'm going to use a place where there's no referendum taking place right now or anything like that, just a completely neutral place. So up here, let's see, I-10, there's County Road 64 extension, County Road 87, it's Lindholm Road that connects the two. Someone bought a bunch of acreage there recently, and they're planning to put some RV parks up there, and they also are just dividing out lots for people to sell and live on. And we had a lot of folks come to that meeting and just plead with the planning commission. This is such a rural area. Please do not let them divide up this land. They are unzoned. The planning commission does not have the power to evaluate whether or not an RV park or a new subdivision is compatible with that area. So what zoning does, it allows a planning commission and the county commission to decide, is this a compatible use on this piece of property? So that's the main thing. If you have any other word, think of the word compatibility. So I know that this particular effort came out of a proposal to put in a multifamily unit development on Lawrence Road. And so if this area had been zoned, there would be a zoning designation, most likely a larger estate or agricultural type zoning in that area, because it's mostly rural. And if the developer wanted to come in and purchase a piece of land, they would have to get it rezoned. And to get it rezoned, they would have to prove that this rezoning is compatible. So in zoning, we say there are really intense uses. I don't know if anybody, I don't mean to like put the audience on the spot or anything, but what's an example of a really intense use that you might not want next to your door to your home? Gas station. A gas station is a classic example. A landfill, right? A fast food restaurant, with bright lights, open late at night, 24/7, maybe even a big box store. Those are intense uses. Right next door to your home. So zoning tries to create a transition from really intense uses to less intense uses. So what would be some of the non-intense uses or very unintense uses? What's an example of that? Farmland, right? Rural agriculture. That's one of our least intense zoning designations. So it's just a piece of rural or agricultural land. So you're trying to create this transition from more intense down to less intense. So if you have agricultural land and someone wants to come and plop a multifamily development, which is a high intense use, they have to go through this zoning process. And if we're doing our job as staff, and our planning commission is doing their job, we're going to evaluate that. And if it's not a proper placement of that, we're going to say, this is not appropriate here in this location. Now, if you have a Walmart and the property next door is proposed to be an apartment complex, that might be an appropriate transition there, right? Because you have a very intense use property next door, maybe a higher intensity multifamily. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more here in a second, but it's ultimately a compatibility check. And that comes with a public hearing. And that public hearing, when it comes to the Planning Commission, y'all get to come and you say, oh, there's this apartment complex proposed here. We want to have a say in this. And then you can explain to the County Commission or the Planning Commission why you don't think it is a compatible use. Now, the Planning Commission, they make a recommendation and ultimately is determined by the County Commission, which is your elected representatives. So it's a citizen-led process. We're here as guests tonight for y'all in this community. It's a compatibility check. Once these rules are put into place, it creates a compatibility check. And it's a way for you to have a voice in how your community develops. I mentioned this group of folks from Styx River who pleading for us not to allow these RV parks or these developments into the area. But our hands are tied because zoning is what gives you the ability to do that compatibility check, and they are unzoned. And that compatibility check is not available. All right, so that's what zoning is. You can ask more questions about that later. Obviously, that's like the not even like the 20,000 foot view, that's like the 100,000 foot view. So let's talk about what zoning is not, because sometimes this gets folks caught up. Zoning is not a way to stop all growth. And it's important to understand that because we don't want folks to pursue zoning thinking that it's a way to stop all growth. So let's say someone has a large agricultural piece of farmland. Zoning comes in and it gets zoned as agricultural. Zoning establishes density requirements for that zoning designation. For rural agricultural, the minimum lot size is 3 acres. All right, so we can do the math together. Let's say it's a 30-acre piece of farmland that's zoned rural agriculture. How many lots can that be divided into? 10, okay? Now still, you can only do 1 dwelling per lot in most situations. So that's still just 10 dwellings that can go on that 30 acres. But notice that zoning didn't stop growth from happening. You could still divide that into a bunch of 3-acre lots and put homes on that if someone bought it and wanted to do it and they met all the subdivision requirements, okay? Because there are other requirements there as well. So it doesn't stop all growth. I also gave the illustration, we have a controversial zoning case up near Spanish Fort where there's a request to put multifamily units closer to the higher intensity businesses that are already up in that area. And those are difficult zoning cases for us to grapple with as staff because it is in an area where there is already this natural transition where you have higher intensity uses. But what we're doing is we're saying instead of putting this apartment complex out in the rural area, we're saying, yeah, you can have an apartment complex, but you need to position it with these other more intense uses in the area. And those, again, are all set as part of that zoning process. So first thing that zoning is not, it's not a way to stop all growth. Second thing that zoning is not, and I think this is important to say, I don't know if this was on anybody's mind in terms of pursuing zoning, but it is not a way to clean up your neighbor's yard, all right? We tell people all the time that we regulate junk yards, but we do not regulate junky yards, okay? So now this might not be true in municipal zoning, and I should probably backpedal here. We're in unincorporated Baldwin County here. If you live inside of municipal city limits, inside all municipal limits in Baldwin County, there is zoning that is zoned, okay? If you're in the unincorporated areas, it all depends on whether or not the citizens have gone through this zoning process. And inside municipalities, they have something called home rule, which gives them a lot of power to pass laws, noise ordinances, yard nuisance ordinances, and things like that. Our zoning ordinance doesn't get down to are they mowing their yard level, okay? It doesn't get down to, are they allowing too much trash in their yard level? Now, if they're operating a junkyard, which is a business, On a residentially zoned piece of property, that's something we can get involved with and make sure they're not inappropriately operating a business on a residential property. We also do work very closely with solid waste, Alabama Department of Environmental Management. If a complaint like that comes in and we don't have any authority over it, we'll help the citizen through the process to see what other avenues there might be to address this situation. So zoning's not a way to stop all growth. It's not a way to clean up your neighbor's yard. And it's not a way to stop subdivisions. So this is an important point here. I like to think of it like soccer and American football. Soccer and football, okay? So you have a sport over here called soccer. We're going to call that zoning. You have this sport over here called football. We're going to call that subdivision regulation. In Baldwin County and in the counties, those are two separate games. Now, you're in an unincorporated area. The game of subdivision regulation already applies in this area. If someone buys a tract of land that's farmland and they want to divide it up into lots, because you're unzoned, you can make that as small as 7,500 square foot lots. All right, so we're talking about a lot of lots per acre because there's no zoning measure that limits how the size of those lots. But they still have to go through a subdivision process that checks traffic, it checks stormwater, they have to build their roads to a certain requirement. It's a very rigorous process. They do have to protect wetlands, but it doesn't check, what's the big word that we learned? The big word that we learned, compatibility, right? It does not check compatibility. It doesn't ask, is this subdivision with a bunch of 7,500 square foot lots, is it compatible with the surrounding uses? So then you have this game over here, zoning. So let's step back and think of this scenario where developers trying to buy this land. And you have gone through the process to put zoning in place. That developer would first have to get it rezoned. It's zoned rural agricultural, we'll say. And if they want to put 7,500 square foot lots in there, what do they have to do, RSF4? They would have to rezone to RSF4, which is residential single family 4, which is a pretty intense residential designation. So we're going to go through that compatibility analysis and say, is this intense residential designation compatible with the surrounding uses? Now, if on three sides of this development, there's already RSF4 neighborhoods, there's a good chance that that rezoning is going to be approved. If all four sides of this parcel's rural agricultural, there's a good chance we're going to recommend denial of that rezoning. And then again, the Planning Commission, which is citizens, vote for a recommendation, and then it ultimately goes to the County Commission. So it's not a way to stop subdivisions, but it's a way to check that compatibility. We discussed how someone with an RA zoning, if it's 30 acres, they could divide that into 10 3-acre lots without going through any type of rezoning process because they're keeping them in very large lots. Okay, so we've talked about what zoning is. We've talked about what zoning is not. Now I want to just talk about the process, all right? So that way you understand where we are, how we got here, and then what happens after February 15th. So to become zoned in Baldwin County, one citizen, or it can be a group of citizens, and there were several citizens that worked together on this process, can come to the county commission and say, we would like zoning in our community. And they propose a map. They propose a boundary. And then we as staff will receive that. We'll look at it with them. There's some nuances in the law. We have to first see if we could use a precinct as a boundary. In this area, that's impossible because there's so many interweaving jurisdictions. So then we look at them to create some natural boundaries. So for instance, when Elizabeth came to us, I think she used 104 initially as the boundary. But just literally a couple parcels up, you hit this currently zoned District 15, so it would have left this unzoned corridor on 104, which just didn't make sense to just leave this unzoned strip. So we said it would be more natural to propose the boundary butt up against Planning District 15 there. So we look at that with her. We just make sure the boundaries are natural and then that they're acceptable to the citizens. We then bring that to our county commission. The county commission just essentially certifies that and sends it to the probate judge. They don't really have a choice. The law basically says if it comes in and it meets requirements, you all have to move it to this next step. So we send it to the probate judge. The probate judge pulls the data for the number of registered voters in that district. Now, we have 4 of these going on right now, so I don't remember what that number was for this one.
237.
2,000, okay. So 2,370 registered voters in this area. So then whoever is pursuing this effort, the citizen, they have to get 10% of the signatures of those registered voters. And so that's 237 in this case. So Elizabeth and Gina Todia was involved in the process as well. And I know that there were probably others, many others, all worked hard to get those signatures, and they were successful in collecting over 237. Those come back to us. The probate judge verifies that all those folks listed are registered voters in the area, and then they bring it back to the county commission, and the county commission just certifies it again. And then they give the probate judge 90 days to schedule that election. So they made very good time in collecting those signatures. I think they came in just before Thanksgiving or just after Thanksgiving.
We did it in 10 days.
All right, I may have broken a new record, but they did a very good job with that. They got those in. That started the 90-day clock. I think December 7th started the 90-day clock. So the probate judge, between all the advertising requirements they have for election, that resulted in the election being scheduled for February 15th. And so that is 2 weeks away, 2 weeks away from tomorrow. So the sample ballot for that is online. We also had notices go out in the mail to registered voters. Those went out in the mail Friday. So some of you probably already received them today or Saturday, or you will receive them this week. Again, it's whatever address shows up with your registration, voter registration. Now, you have to be a registered voter to vote. So if you've just heard about this and maybe you recently moved to this district, you need to make sure you go through that process and get registered to vote. A sample ballot is online. There's a web address on that letter. You can also go to our planning and zoning homepage. There's a link, a blue button there that says the upcoming elections. You can see the map. You can see a bunch of frequently asked questions, but that sample ballot's very simple. It's one question. You're going to walk in there. It's maybe going to be one of the simplest ballots you've ever voted on, and it's just going to say either yes, I want to come under the planning and zoning jurisdiction of Baldwin County, or no, I do not want to come under the planning and jurisdiction of Baldwin County. So it's going to be a very simple do or don't type question. So let's talk about what happens if you vote no, if the majority votes against this. If the majority votes against it, for the next 2 years, that community cannot pursue voting or zoning. So there's a 2-year ban on pursuing zoning. If the community votes in favor of bringing zoning in, that the next day, a 6-month moratorium goes into place in the area. Now let's talk about what that moratorium covers. It might be easier to talk about what it doesn't cover. It does not cover single-family homes or basic projects associated with a normal single-family home, okay? It doesn't cover family subdivisions. It doesn't cover court-ordered subdivisions. And it does not cover complete applications that have been received prior to the vote. And I know that impacts this community specifically, and we can talk about that a little bit more later if you'd like. Excuse me, but the purpose of that moratorium coming into place is because once y'all vote for it, y'all have voted to do this, but you haven't set up your rules yet. You haven't set up what those zoning rules are that are going to apply to this new area. So that 6-month moratorium allows the community to work toward preparing those rules. So now let's talk about the process, that rulemaking process. So the county commission will appoint 5 registered voters from the community to sit on an advisory committee. And that advisory committee, the way we'll collect interest in that, we don't just go out and handpick people or anything like that. We'll get with anybody we know who's interested. So you can email us now. We'll reach out to Elizabeth and anybody else who is involved in the process and just say, hey, listen, anybody you know who's interested, have them fill out this form and email it to me. Those will be emailed in. We'll try to reach out to everyone and just talk. Guess what the number one qualification is for sitting on the advisory committee? Well, so that is a qualification. The number one qualification, though, is you got to show up to the meetings, all right? Because we find that sometimes that's the most difficult thing when you set up an advisory committee is people are busy. We understand it. So we got to have folks they want to be involved, and then they're willing to show up and understand the process. And what we'll do, this advisory committee will come together. Staff will coordinate the whole process. So it's not something that's going to be a burden to the committee other than attending. And we'll actually, the first 2 or 3 meetings, it'll almost be like a planning and zoning academy, because we'll explain all the process, how the system works in the other districts, so that way you kind of understand all the moving parts. And then we'll say, now let's start working on the 2 parts of this zoning, which is a map that identifies all the different colors, and you've probably seen zoning maps before, and then the rule book. What are the rules that apply for all these different zoning designations on the map? So you'll work together with that as a team. Our team members will help you through that process, and it'll go through a couple iterations. And then the goal is to get to a point where the advisory committee makes a unanimous recommendation on a map and a rule book. Now, I don't want you all to think, if that gets to that point, that you're going to have to start drafting something from scratch. We do have, I always can't remember the number, but I think something like 15 or 16 zone districts right now. Something like that. And so we have rules that apply to those. And so usually we'll start with those as a starting point. And then we have these local provisions where you can carve out things and say, we don't want, I know that it's generally allowed in the full rule book, but for our district, we're not going to allow this. Or for our district, we are going to allow this. So that's part of those local provisions. That gets presented to the Planning Commission as a recommendation from the advisory committee. The Planning Commission then votes and makes a recommendation to the County Commission, and the County Commission then adopts the final ordinance. Through that whole process, usually there are small iterative changes. We'll learn something along the way that, oh, this property here, it was recently approved as a subdivision by Fairhope or something like that, which means now it's already smaller lots and it might actually need to have a different zoning designation because it's just not showing up on the map yet or something. So there might be little tweaks that go as we go through that. But on District 19, I don't know, there were 4 or 5 changes that got made from the advisory committee to the county commission, and the advisory committee still had unanimous support for those 5 changes that came to the county commission, and then the county commission adopted with that. So that's how the process goes. And then as soon as that's adopted, the moratorium disappears, and that starts then your zone. Now you might say, well, how do you enforce zoning? Because then it continues from there, right? Now it's active. Well, the way zoning is enforced, I tell people all the time, we're the referees. So Selena and Buford and myself, we're just referees. And the way that we enforce the rules in this game of zoning is, if you are going to develop something, and that means adding an extension to your home, building a new home, if you want to build let's say a auto mechanic shop, you have to submit what's called a site plan application. That's $25 for most residential type projects. A commercial project, it's a little bit more expensive, but we tell people it's a lot less than your building permit's going to be. And all we do when that comes in, we check to make sure you're not building the building right up against your neighbor's property. We check to make sure you're not building a 50-foot observation tower on top of your house or something so you can spy on all your neighbors, if that's not allowed in the ordinance. Again, we look at the rule book that y'all approved and say, what's allowed in this district? And it's a pretty quick process, and for most people it just flies right through. And then for the more intense uses, we look at that as well. So I've given that brief overview, kind of gone through the process. One thing I do want to note, because sometimes this catches people off guard, is that we also regulate as part of zoning in most districts. Again, some of this could potentially be tweaked depending on what you would decide for your rules, is we regulate land disturbances. This means if you're going to go and dig a pond on your property, we won't be saying you can't do it, but we're going to say you're required to submit something so we can make sure you're putting up silt fence and stuff like that, so it's not going to go fill the river and stuff like that. Again, it's a $25 permit, and all you're doing is making sure you got that erosion control in place, which with the rain we get in Baldwin County, I think most of us realize that you turn up soil in Baldwin County, And if it's left unstabilized during one of our storm events, it's going to be in one of our rivers before long. So I live in a zoned area, so I know the steps that you have to go through. And, you know, the other day I was like, boy, I really need to build a retaining wall here. And I was like, okay, well, I need to make sure I can do it in a way that would comply with zoning, because I'm going to have to submit an application and get it approved just like anybody else. So is it okay?
Let's talk about some positives.
Sure, sure.
I don't want to quiz you, but I'm going to quiz you. All right, let's talk about District 15. We all know that's Bell Forest. What are some rules that they passed as far as what is allowed and what is not allowed?
Okay.
I'll point you in the right direction.
Okay.
Basically, they said no apartments. Residential lots can only be R3 or bigger, kind of positives. What was District 15 able to do?
Okay. Elizabeth has put me on the spot there a little bit, because we have lots of different local provisions in all areas. I'm going to tell you one that I know a lot better than District 15. And I hope that doesn't disappoint you.
No.
But District 25, they're dealing with a lot of issues down there just in terms of access to services, ability for vehicles to get in during a storm event. So they actually limited your ability to upzone. So if you have RSF 1, which allows one dwelling per 30,000 square feet, then they don't allow you to go to RSF 2 or RSF 3 or RSF 4 above a certain point, basically. And that's something they did in their local provisions. Every single one of these districts have slightly different local provisions. District 19, we just went through that one. They limited all multifamily. I don't think they allowed anything, any multi-unit developments within that district. Now, it's a very small district as well. So those are some of the local provision options that you have.
So I know some of the people have been confused about agricultural use within a zoned area. Some people are like, I don't want to do that because I can't have chickens anymore, or I can't have a horse, or I can't, I mean, as a horse owner,
Sure.
that would have been my concern as well. But to explain the difference between city ordinance and zoned areas.
That's a great question. So because this is in the unincorporated areas, and there was a recent law change that said a city can't regulate any ordinances, with very few exceptions, outside the corporate limits anymore. The only thing that would really apply to this would now be zoning, if you are zoned. In many districts, you can only have agricultural, let's say livestock and things like that, in an agricultural district. But guess what? That's something you get to decide. You get to.
Be a provision, because in my vision, which I'm just one person, but I would envision our first provision says any act of animal husbandry and horticulture is allowed. So if you want to have 4 chickens in your yard, it should be universally allowed in District 37.
Sure.
Is that a type of provision we could do?
Absolutely, absolutely. You could make it so that way anything that's RSF 4 or lower can have chickens or husbandry. That is up to y'all to do. Now, most people, if they have, so there's something called residential single-family estate, which is like the biggest residential lot, and the minimum lot size is 80,000 square feet, so you're just under 2 acres. But that a lot of folks, we find if they have horses or something, their lot's at least 2 acres that they're operating off of. And like that's a zoning designation a lot of them have, and that allows horses and things of that nature. But again, we're talking about the existing rule book. Y'all get to make those decisions for your rule book. I would note that we're actually investigating. So, and maybe I should be careful about how much I say here, but for Seminole, which is this proposed District 36, we're investigating a really trimmed down version of zoning for them. Now, y'all are right on the borders of one of the fastest growing communities in Alabama. And because of that, quite frankly, the trimmed down version is probably would probably not work in this area. But y'all can use local provisions to trim down whatever you need to in the entire thing.
I think the goal, and what a lot of people, and I speak for myself, but most people in District 37, the goal is to not have rules. The goal would be to
Yeah.
So is there a way we can do both with zoning?
Sure. So it's going to be harder here than it would be in Seminole, just because there are already some pretty intense commercial uses in there, and I always want to be careful. But I tell people that in some ways my job description is to try to put the county in the most legally defensible position, and a blanket restriction across the board on most uses would probably not be a very legally defensible position. So we're trying to find that right position that meets what the community's desires are in terms of zoning, but also making sure it's something that will stand up, because Alabama is a property rights state. Now, I think there was a great point brought up about the agricultural uses. We are getting more and more interest from the agricultural community in zoning. And historically, the agricultural community has been a little bit more concerned about zoning. And someone gave this illustration the other day, and it apparently came from a popular TV show out there right now, but there's a scene where a rancher and an Indian are talking, and the rancher's getting pushed out by development, and the Indian says something like, "Y'all are the Indians now," to this rancher, and the rancher's like, "Oh, wow, yeah, I didn't even really think about that." But these rural communities that have kind of become the norm in places like Baldwin County, they're the ones being pushed out now. And zoning can actually help preserve a rural lifestyle if it's done correctly. And again, that's why that advisory committee exists, to shape and direct that process.
I got a question for you. You talk about zoning, you're talking about whatever. Say I own 10 acres of land. My children, as far as agriculture as it stands right now, can I give them 2 acres to build a house on? Or is that making, or seeing as agriculture, you said 3 acres, I have to be minimums.
So
That's what, can I go with that, whatever, can I, this is yours.
Sure. Now, so now we're talking about 2 games there, right? We talked about how there's this subdivision game, and that's how you slice up property. So that game is active right now. So let's talk about how the process would work right now. Right now, since you're in an unzoned area, if you wanted to slice and dice your property, there's something called a family division that's allowed under Alabama law currently, that would allow you to slice off a piece of your land. You have to submit an application. But right now it's a free application, and it's a very fast process. You slice off that piece of property. If you're zoned, that game is still active over here with the subdivision, but now the thing you have to check is whether or not you're slicing off a piece of property that meets the size requirements. So under the current rule book that most of the county's operating on, in a rural agricultural piece of property for a family division, the minimum lot size is 40,000 square feet. So they have this special provision that if you're giving property to a family, as long as it's 40,000 square feet, so about an acre or more, you can just go through, submit this thing online. About 7 days later, they just say, yeah, this is okay to do, and you just deed it off to them.
40,000 square feet, is it 1 acre?
That's right, 1 acre, yes, sir. No, I understand. So that's right. So it would have that process in place. Now, let's say that another option is if you wanted to do something less than 3 acres, and I'm getting too complicated with that, but that's the simple example.
Zoning does not stop you from
Yes.
doing that.
That's right. Yes, ma'am.
Can zoning help us with the red clay regulations? I know a lot of the area is being pulled away from Fairhope, so that some of the good things Fairhope requires, and red clay and wetlands, can we control how close somebody can be to wetlands?
Absolutely.
And also traffic.
Okay.
If they had put that, or if they put a huge apartment complex on Lawrence Road, I live in Long Pine, I have to get off on 48. It's so hard now at certain times. Traffic's really picked up in the last few years, I guess, at commuting times.
Sure. And that's one.
Going, and it's gonna turn it, I don't wanna see Highway 59.
Sure. So I'm gonna.
Either on 180
So I'm going to address both those points real quickly.
Okay.
In the zoning rule book, we have provisions that do address wetlands. And it basically says you can't do a development within 30 feet of a wetland. And if you're going to disturb any type of soil, you've got to make sure you have erosion control up. Now I say any type of soil, I'm not talking about if you go out and get a shovel and plant a plant in your yard. I'm saying if you're going to go out and, what? Well, yeah, or a sandbox or anything like that. But if you're going to go and dig up soil and put it to build a home, to start to prep the foundation for a home, you've got to have erosion control up for that. And if you're within 30 feet of a wetland, you're not allowed to be within 30 feet of a wetland. Now, that brings us to a thing. There is something that if you say, listen, most of my lot's covered by wetlands, you're telling me I can't build a home here? Well, there's something called a variance process, which goes to a board of adjustments. It's a group of citizens. And that looks to say, you know what, in this situation, there's a hardship on the land. There's not room to build a home because of these wetlands, so we're going to give them a variance to this ordinance. You can't do that and build a big subdivision. You can't get a variance for that. But if you just had a lot that's been in your family for 50 years, and now you want one of your grandchildren to be able to build a home on it, and it turns out you're going to have to get inside that wetland buffer, that's what that variance process is there for, to make that available to you.
Can we control also, these guys come in and they trash every tree and every landform, when they're building these subdivisions, and then they load it up with red clay. So now you have houses sitting in rows with rotten privacy fences, baking in the sun.
So that's a great question.
Still live there.
Sure, no, great question, and I'll turn to my two colleagues here. We don't have a tree portion of our zoning ordinance. We have landscape buffer requirements for businesses, but that's something that could be, I believe, written into your local provisions, that if you're going to do a subdivision, for instance, in Baldwin or in your district, then there needs to be some type of preservation of existing trees where possible, or things of those nature. And if y'all, if this will goes through and the advisory committee says this is something we want to go, that's staff is working for you to say, okay, the advisory committee wants us to look into a local provision that would require the preservation of trees in some type of, if a larger development did come in. And then we would help craft an ordinance that would accomplish that and remain within the bounds of what's legal within that zoning ordinance.
I can just see some people worried about how they can use their land. If we don't have zoning and we can't build anything, somebody could come and rip out every tree right to their property line and expose you to the back of their barn.
And that's something that I was,
It's just,
yeah.
you're not trying to restrict anybody, but it's, I guess, a way to have manners.
Sure,
Yeah,
sure.
that's a great zoning way to have manners.
No, that's right, that's right. Zoning, in some ways, you've heard the adage that tall fences make great neighbors. Zoning is almost like a modern tall fence in some ways, and how those rules work. Again, I don't want to bore everybody tonight or anything like that.
You talked about the Baldwin County having tremendous amount of rain, which has, at this point, some natural flow, either from wetlands or from the slope of the land. When these builders are coming in, they're disturbing the natural flow. When there is unzoned property facing a property which is a private residence, which is in a ditch or naturally sitting lower, since it is unzoned, they can dump the water on you, collect it, so they protect their property and dump it on your land. Can they do that?
So that's actually
Correct, we are in moratorium. So what's happened in that moratorium, when they disturb and redirect the water, protecting their new build, and don't care where it goes after that?
So the way the process is supposed to work, and if you're aware of a situation where it's not working, that's something we're happy to look into. But the subdivision process requires them to look at how much water is leaving the site, it's called the Q, the flow rate, how much water is leaving the site before it's developed, and then they have to show the calculations for how much water is leaving the site after it's developed, and they have to design it so that way the Q rate is less after development than it was prior to development. That's something that the engineers check during the subdivision process. And, you know, if, that's just part of that subdivision review process. And when it lets out, they can't just dump it randomly into a neighbor's yard. They would have to preserve the general flow.
What engineers? What engineers, the county engineers? How are you involved in that
Okay.
process?
All right, great question. So when it comes in our door, we do review the subdivision, and the county engineer reviews the drainage and traffic calculations for the subdivision.
Who does it on zone properties now?
The county engineer does.
So it does later when it's zoned?
That's right.
Pretty much the same person?
Yeah, zoning wouldn't change who reviews
Okay.
The drainage review, you know.
But zoning would tell them that they're allowed to build it or not allowed to build it.
I understand.
So, and you know, I'm gonna just say at the end of the day, we're just referees. I was on a lengthy phone conversation at 5:30 today with, again, someone in Fort Morgan who wants to build basically a 50-foot house, and they've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on the design at this point. The lot itself costs over $1 million. And then I'm saying, our zoning ordinance doesn't allow that. And, you know, they're kind of saying, yeah, what? I can't believe you're going to tell me this is not allowed. And I say, listen, I'm just the referee. This is the rule book that this community has established. And I'm not taking sides here. I'm just saying this is the rule book. I'm just the referee in this game, either throwing the yellow flag or carrying out a rule saying that someone stepped out of bounds in this game. And that's just what the rules say. And so currently there's rules that govern stormwater. And those all go through a review. Their drainage calculations are submitted by a professional engineer and then reviewed by the county engineer's office to make sure they're meeting the requirements of our regulations.
Is required to submit it to the county engineer. Well, of course, when it's in their interest, it's not very objective, correct?
Well, and let me.
It's the county engineer who is the referee here.
So now let me. So we still manage the process. So they actually submit it to our office. We make sure they've submitted everything. We make sure they've submitted a drainage report that's signed and sealed by a professional engineer. And then we put that, basically package it up and send it to the county engineer and said, here's the drainage report they've submitted, here's the traffic study they've submitted. And the county engineer has a dedicated team that reviews those. And listen, there have been times where we get into a little bit of a disagreement with the county engineer's office, and we kind of have to bounce things back and forth. But at the end of the day, they are the referees over that traffic study and drainage report. And so at the end of the day, we defer to them, but we try to double check each other when something comes up and we said, hey, did you notice this? And things of that nature. Yes, sir.
Kind of a general question, and it has to do with the moratorium. If a developer has already submitted his designs to the county, but the county hasn't said yea or nay yet, but he also has to submit it to the Fairhope Planning Commission. And that process has already taken place, but they haven't gotten approval from the Fairhope Planning Commission. And if they don't get it before the moratorium goes in, are they still allowed to process on because they were in before the vote?
So the way our rule book reads right now is that when the moratorium rules, that if they have a complete application, I understand there's apparently been some confusion on this question or this issue, and it may be this word complete, but in our office, a complete application means that they have submitted everything that they're required to submit for the application. And once we do what's called a pre-screen process. We check to make sure they've submitted everything they're supposed to. It doesn't mean it's perfect, because every application gets comments and things like that. But they've submitted their wetland delineation. If it shows potential wetlands, they've submitted their drainage report, traffic study. All those things have been submitted. They've paid their fee. then it's a complete application. And if that complete application has been received in the door prior to the vote, then it will get to continue along the process. Now, if at some point they let that complete application lapse, or it would have to get either denied, it would have to get closed out because either they failed to respond or because it gets affirmatively denied, then at that point it would become subject to the moratorium.
So what if that happens, they submit a new application during the moratorium?
Oh, we wouldn't accept a new application during the moratorium.
Once the application gets denied, they cannot submit a new one until the moratorium is over.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. But it does, listen, I understand what most of these referendums are birthed out of a project people don't like. Unfortunately, usually that project is already in the pipeline by the time the vote takes place. But the good news is, if this is something you care about in terms of having more say in the community down the road, it's not going to stop with this project. So it at least gets you in the door on the next project to be able to have that voice. And again, something may happen to that project that stirred things up. You just never know. But you do have to understand, if a complete project's in the door, it continues moving despite the moratorium.
I know there's a process in the Fairhope Planning Commission where you can submit information about what we think a professional engineer may think that there are errors in their stormwater drainage, or a professional engineer may think that there's errors in their sewage plant. Is there a system like that within the county that we could submit comments to?
Absolutely. So you can send those directly to myself. You can send them to Buford. Buford actually shepherds that process. I think he's actually the one reviewing this specific project because this project's in. Because this is in what's called the planning jurisdiction, both entities get to review it, but Fairhope holds the public hearing. So it has to meet our requirements and their requirements. So if you have if you're aware of items that we should know about as a team, by all means, send those our way. But most of that traction is going to come from whatever entity's holding the public hearing, because they're the ones who are going to make that public vote on it. But we'd love to hear that as well. So
I have a zoning question.
yes.
What if you live in your cute little house and you want to put a shed in the back and run your little Etsy business? Is that allowed under zoning?
Okay, great question. Sir, I know you've raised your hand a couple times. I promise I'm going to get you next, okay? So there's something in our ordinance that are called home occupation. So this is if you run a little home business out of your home. First of all, when zoning comes in, everything is grandfathered as it exists. So if you are running a mechanic shop in your backyard and you have employees coming there and everything like that, that's grandfathered. You can't build 10 more bays. You're not allowed to expand it, but you get to keep what you got. But let's talk about the home business. Maybe you're doing wedding dress alterations, or you're baked goods, or some type of Etsy thing. There's a couple rules. Basically, the best way to think about it is you can do that business as long as it doesn't create something that would make it obvious to your neighbors that you're running some type of commercial enterprise.
It's not a nuisance.
That's right, and that's really what it comes down to. And some of the rules that we have in place to check that is you're not allowed to have employees who are not your family members work in your home-based business. And again, if you're a zoned residential, this is if you're doing it in your home and it's based residential. You can't display things from the road. So you can't have a big display window with flashing lights saying, "Oh, look, come buy this product from us." And I honestly can't remember all the other provisions. Those are, I think, the two main ones, though. The other thing is there's a size requirement, and I can't recall what it is, but it's a percentage of your dwelling. So if you have a 2,000 square foot home and you're using all 2,000 square feet for your business, I don't know, there's an argument you probably need to go ahead and get it bona fide commercial set up and everything. But there's a percentage that you can set aside. But if your operation is getting larger than that, then you basically need to pursue the normal commercial route. Again, that's grandfathered folks are grandfathered. There's a lot of that when a new district comes in. This is for someone who wants to start something new after zoning has come into place. Great question. Yes, sir, you had a question.
Going back to the flooding issue in the engineering report, say the engineers, the county engineers or whomever approves it, says this is gonna work, and then it doesn't. Who, at that point, do you have to come back on to say, fix it? And how do you make them fix it?
Okay. Well, that is a difficult question because it happens with every permit that comes through the county, whether it's a building permit, whether it's a subdivision permit, whether it's a site plan approval. People can represent things on those documents, and as staff, it's not, we can check things according to our rule book, but unfortunately you can't, if someone is intentionally trying to misrepresent something, sometimes you just can't catch those, you know? Some mistakes you can't catch. So that's why that engineer who signed and stamped that thing in the world of professional engineering carries liability with that stamp. There is a big deal for him to stamp that, and if he misengineered it, he has liability for that. Now, certainly, we as the county, if we're aware that something's been missed that we should have caught, we're going to do our best to try and get involved. But at the end of the day, that county engineer, if he misdesigns, or not, I'm sorry, make sure I did that. Not that private design engineer who put his stamp on that drainage calculation is the one who bears the responsibility, and they carry liability insurance and everything like that for these types of situations.
We got situations right now
It's on you to hire more.
where the county says it was Fairhope says it's the county's. There are, I don't know who's gonna come out on that, but that's an old engineering study that provides beautiful flooding every time we get a fairly
Sure.
decent rain, which is relatively often. The new proposal is for another, building permit for an apartment complex, going off that old engineering study, which doesn't work. And they're gonna put in a slightly better drainage system, which will inevitably flood much better than the present.
Sure, sure.
And it is, right now, when it floods, or when we have a fairly serious rain, I think it's about 12 houses have no access out of their neighborhood because it's 2 feet underwater, the road.
Sure.
My backyard is downstream from there, and it floods fairly significantly. And from what we understand, it'll probably flood all the way up to the house now. That's 100 yards out of the stream.
Sure, sure.
And we're a little concerned about this because it doesn't seem to us that anybody's assuming responsibility or even admitting responsibility.
You know, I think you'll understand, and I'll get to you in just a second. I think you'll understand that the county, and really any government agency, but just the county cannot design everybody's project for them. And we don't design people's projects for them. What we do is we make them submit it through a licensed professional who bears that liability responsibility, and then we check certain parameters to make sure they use the correct factor in their precondition calculation, and we check a number of different factors that they're using the correct storm event. But at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that professional engineer who designed it still couldn't have made some mistakes. But that's why there are professional engineers, and that's why there are medical doctors who bear that liability in these serious situations for this very reason. And I know you wanted a kind of maybe a different answer to that, but
I would like to have a different answer, but I understand what you're saying. But the problem I'm having with this whole process is they are going off absolutely false data on the flood situation. They're using old data.
Let me talk about stormwater drainage. I'm a professional engineer.
Okay.
Just briefly. They are required to provide a current assessment of what the drainage is. They're not using any old engineering, they're not using grandpa's memory. They have to do a solid engineering based on a 100-year rainfall average and several
turned in 600 pages of calculations that showed what it was when they bought the property and how it flooded 3 different areas. Now, all the rules really say is they have to contain that flooding or divert it from their property in some way so that the amount of flooding water going off per hour is less than it was when it was going off in the original situation. So if we had 100 cubic feet of water per hour going off into Still Creek, then they have to have less than 100 cubic feet of water going off. The problem with stormwater retention though, if you get 12 inches in 6 hours, and you get 100 cubic feet of water per hour running off, you're not gonna get it for more than 6 hours. But if they retain all of that water, then you're gonna get 100 cubic feet per hour for 20 hours. And so the result is gonna be more physical water for a the same amount of physical water, but a much longer time. That part of the timing doesn't always get really introduced into the evaluation.
Part of it, what I'm talking about, development has been going on and massive amounts of pavement 2 blocks upstream on this. As far as I know, nothing was ever said, done, or even thought about drainage problems.
Let me.
With that 300-foot notification, even knew that these things were going to happen.
So let me say this, because we're getting into the weeds on a specific project and the details of a specific project, and those are actually subdivision subdivision issues where zoning that y'all are pursuing would have checked the compatibility of that project, and that compatibility was checked, so that use check. But we pointed out the man who is at least reviewing it from our subdivision side, not the stormwater, but he would be happy to take a closer look at some of these higher level things and just pinging the highway department a little bit to make sure we're not missing something that a local resident might have a little bit more knowledge on of what's occurring there. And I think that's probably where we should leave that tonight, because we can only get into the weeds so much.
There's 2 apartments that were in our district, I'm sure you do know.
That's right.
But the Lawrence Road and then the Skyline, and he's on
Okay,
that.
so you were talking about the Skyline one. Okay. Okay. Okay.
So it's 2
Okay.
different.
That's right. We're happy to take any specific information you have and through email or something like that, and trying to make sure that's being properly vetted from our.
What we've seen so far is, and I'm sure the engineering on it is done well, but it's wrong. And I know the traffic study is absolutely wrong, but those aren't the worst issues. There are a whole bunch of others that are bigger problems.
Sure. Well, listen.
But I am concerned about the flooding thing because my neighbors can't get out of their neighborhood.
Sure. No, that is very serious.
Sir, I'm happy to give you my information. You can call me one day.
Okay.
Because, like Matthew said, we could get into the weeds and talk about drainage for days.
Yeah.
And understand, like Matthew has said several times tonight, it all comes down to authority and what cities can do, what counties can do, and that sort of thing. If we tried to make a 5,000-year storm event part of the subdivision regulations, that would probably be viewed as a regulatory taking and would be overturned.
Yeah.
So I get it, sir.
Just to
I'll
help
give you
wrap
my.
it up.
Yeah.
You can hang out. But I guess the short story is you can nitpick every little aspect of zoning, but I think what we've learned tonight is if we don't do something now, the situations are gonna continue to get worse. The developments are gonna get worse. The little problems we have now are like we have 2 apartments, in our district that we don't want right now. If we don't pass zoning, that number could be 6, 7, 8. If we don't act now, we're already almost 10 years too late on this zoning thing. So we have to act now or it's just gonna get worse. Yeah, that's my speech. I get so nervous up here, but.
I just have something to say. I really want the zoning to go in so that we have a say, because D.R. Horton does not
Yeah, the developers don't care.
And
Yeah,
when they build, and there's problems somewhere else in the county where they didn't even pour the foundations right.
right,
Those houses are gonna go under, and they're not gold certified.
right. And I
So,
mean,
I
if we don't do the zoning now, it's only gonna get worse. And I feel like I am a great steward of this. I know everybody in the district. If I don't know you, I know someone who knows you, or I'm related to you. I can be your personal connection to Matthew and to the county on this zoning stuff. It's not some stranger coming in saying, let's get zoned and have all these rules. Like, I don't want rules, but I sure as heck don't want an apartment complex or a Lowe's. I don't want them to destroy 104 like they already are. We have to stop it now, and that's with zoning. You may have a rule or two. You can't put your barn 10 foot off your neighbor's yard. Well, your neighbor probably wouldn't want you to do that anyways, but that's okay. I feel like it's okay to sacrifice a little bit of rules to have a whole lot of peace. And what zoning is gonna do is bring peace to District 37. It's gonna tell the developers that they need to go to Silver Hill, and then that's where I'm headed next. And Silver Hill, if you're listening, that's where I'm headed next. Because we have to stand up for our town. This is our town. This is not the developer's town. And this isn't necessarily a fight of neighbor trying to tell neighbor what to do. This is our community telling the developers what they can do. And that's how I feel about zoning, and that's why I think it's so important. Any questions?
I got one from Matt. Let's say somebody has 40 acres that's relatively close to this Florence Road project. That's going to already have high density. How much say-so am I going to have over what the board does as far as saying, well, he's close to that, so we're going to put him at a high density on my 40 acres. I don't want that to happen. You know, how can we stop that? Because you said, well, you're in proximity of this, so you can now do that. So if somebody between me and that becomes high density because they're next to him, then I'm the next guy over, so I'm high density because I'm there. I mean, how can we control that?
That's a great question. I was thinking about that very question today with this specific project. And it would be very important on how that site with the apartment complex gets zoned. So let's assume that project goes forward.
Let's not assume that.
Okay, we'll assume that. So if that project were to go forward and zoning were to still get put into place, we don't necessarily have to zone things to their current use. We can zone things to the way it should be properly, from less intense to more intense, or more intense to less intense, to avoid the situation where there's spot zoning, because that's what can occur. Otherwise, you have these spot zones where you have a really intense use in the middle of nowhere because it was done prior to zoning. And one thing we look at in our rezoning reports is we look at things like, we'll be like, why is this RMF 6, residential multifamily 6, right in the middle of this rural area? Because I'm thinking 10 years down the road, if something happens, or 5 years down the road, we'll say, okay, oh, that was here when zoning came into place, so for that reason, we'll let our planning commission know, and we will not place very much weight on that, because it was not ever properly rezoned.
It was grandfathered.
That's right, it was a grandfather use that came in that way. So, but you're right, that is tricky, and that's why the earlier, if this is important, because again, we're neutral, this is a citizen-driven process, but that's why you do it now. It may not stop controversial developments that are in place now, but it lets you have that say down the road before there's tons of them.
Well, I hope this passes. We tried it about 20 years ago. We voted out in County Road 9, and it got defeated. I mean, nobody was for it, but everybody thought, oh, well, I got 40 acres, 50 acres, 60 acres. I can't even have cows anymore if we have zoning. Oh, I can't park my motorhome on my property. That's not what this is about. This is about, controlling this unbelievable growth we got going on.
It's up to all of us to spread that to our neighbors. The misinformation is what defeats this.
Exactly.
Yeah. If everyone, that would be my request. If everyone could just post on their own social media. I didn't know that not everybody was on Facebook, but apparently not everyone is on Facebook. So if you could just spread, if you know someone who lives in the district, just spread the warmth and love that zoning will bring them. And just spread the truth, because there is a lot of misinformation. People were on the Nextdoor app saying, you couldn't, or someone was on Facebook saying you couldn't have a bonfire, you can't have chickens, you can't shoot fireworks. None of that is true under zoning. It's not an HOA. It's a density land use map. It's simple. There's no need to complicate zoning, is there?
And you'll find, Elizabeth, county zoning is not nearly as intense or as stringent regulatory-wise as city zoning. Whereas city zoning, because of its very nature and because of the power that cities have, they prohibit fireworks and bonfires and fireworks and et cetera.
Can I talk about economics just a little? We need your support in this District 37. We looked into sending a postcard, 40 cents, to 2,336 voters in the district. That's $1,000 in postage, just in postage. Not the printing, not the ink, anything else. And we decided, we even cut it down to get it closer to $500, but we decided we can't do that right now. We have a GoFundMe site for the Save Lawrence Road, and that's available for the 37 district as well. If you want to help us and support us, we've incurred. We had to do what you would have to do to get after the professional engineer. You have to go hire a lawyer.
Yeah, y'all need to hire a lawyer like tomorrow at 8 a.m. Okay, yeah.
And we've had to pay $10,000 today for that lawyer to do all of this. And we think it's worth it, because we think we can win. But we need your help too.
And side note, I do have signs. I don't know if y'all have seen our little blue signs, but I have about 10 left. If you guys want one, I have them here. They're $15 a piece, and that's just to recoup our costs that we got. But if y'all want a sign, I have 10. If y'all want like 100 more, we can get those, but I don't know if we'll need that. They should be at every intersection. Have y'all seen them out and about?
But that doesn't
You
say
haven't seen
District 37.
It does at
That
the bottom.
says Lawrence Road.
No.
Two signs.
There's a blue and a yellow sign, and they're almost at every intersection. And that's the goal. If you buy a sign and you want to sponsor an intersection, that would be great too. But they say, stop paving paradise, vote yes, District 37, and then at the bottom it has our Facebook link.
People that live in a subdivision like Long Pond, Miranda's, Bearhead Falls, we may try to get at least one person on every street or to sponsor.
Yeah.
Word of mouth, walking your neighborhood, talking to your neighbors, it's not gonna happen just from the signs.
It's important for the people who live in Long Pines, for example, to know that they're in District 37.
I think Long Pine's got,
I'm in there.
how many people knocked on your door? How many different people knocked on your door?
One gentleman across the street came over and I signed the petition.
Okay, did anybody else? Because there was about,
And it's so hard to communicate around
yeah,
here.
there was about three different groups went to Long Pines.
I went down
Yeah, there's a lot of doors. There's a lot of doors.
first three streets coming off of 48.
Yeah.
The county put out a letter Friday. Will the county do that again before the election?
That's the only letter they put out.
Okay, just the one letter.
You gotta get people to.
We're also budget limited, sir.
Yeah.
Well, I understand.
All our budget on everything.
40 cents times 2,300. My goodness, that's $996.
We sent out over 5,000 of those.
Yeah, and if anybody knows anybody that doesn't agree with zoning, just have them get in contact with me. And if I don't have the answer, I know a few people who do have the answers. So that would be my biggest request, is if you know of somebody who doesn't want zoning, let's try to figure out why. Let's try to solve their problems. I don't want the citizens to be upset and I don't want anyone to feel like, man, we got zoned and I don't want this. I would like, in a perfect world, for everyone to be on board. This is a community event. The community needs to be involved. So if we know anyone who doesn't like zoning, do you have a question?
Something I'd like to add to where you're going with that right there. I think it's important to acknowledge that there's a lot of people in this district that have had this land for many years. It's been passed down through their family, and some of them are ready to sell this land and realize the tremendous profit
Oh,
And
completely.
they should be able to do that. But when you're trying to talk to folks like you just mentioned there that may be against this and say, I don't want any zoning, their fear may be that they can't sell their land and make any money on it. They think they have to sell it to, a Horton Homes or someone like that and get the 7,000 square foot lot size. With the rural agricultural at 3 acres per lot, the value they're gonna get for a lot, those 5 lots at 3 acres apiece is still going to be an extremely significant amount of revenue for those folks.
Yeah.
And they have that right. And then you're gonna have developments that are more in tune with what's the rest of the area is like, whether it's still a residential farm or whatever it is. If they turn it into if you guys didn't have it for your kids, you wanted to turn that into 10 3-acre parcels and sell that and go, live on the beach, you could do that.
Right.
And it would still be in tune with the rest of the neighborhood. And otherwise, it's going to be all these postage stamp lots. And eventually, the value of this land is all going to go down because it's going to be overrun with those places.
Yeah, and there's not too many large landowners left, I don't think. I think it's more of these small landowners, maybe the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 acre lots. If you've lived on a 5 acre lot for 20 years, I feel like those are the people who don't want the zoning, they don't want the rules. But like Matthew said, zoning does not stop development. You can still, there's still going to be subdivisions. It's just going to happen. But yeah, you can definitely still sell your land.
Yeah, can't there be a Facebook page
Hmm.
that says District 37?
There is one. I'm so, you're the one who said you don't understand Facebook, right? Not to call you out.
I'm gonna guess.
Okay.
I don't sit with a phone.
Yeah, there is. There is. Yeah, she'll get you signed up to it. We have 312 people on it right now, and there's 2,000 people in our district, so we're missing a lot of people on there. But all right.
My daughter's gonna be traveling on the 15th for work. Is there any way she can vote?
So you can vote absentee, and absentee, Judy Newcomb, and we have a link on our webpage that we just stood up. It just takes you to the absentee site, but then you'll need to call the absentee manager, and they'll tell you your different options. I think you have to do mail-in by a certain date, otherwise I think you can go to the Bayonne courthouse. I know that seems out of the way, but, so there are ways to still vote absentee in this election.
Who did they call?
Judy Newcomb is the absentee ballot manager for any elections in Baldwin County. And there's a link on the webpage for these elections that will take you to her site that has a phone number and things like that.
Yes.
Having just gone through this in District 19, I was encouraged, all of you, to, first of all, don't forget, you did the sign up on the petition in world record time.
Right.
You've got to go back and continue that near election day. Do the same process, same people, make sure you turn out your vote. Whether you're for it or against it, you need to turn out your vote. The other thing I would say is, assuming that this passes, when you move to the advisory committee part of this, Matthew and his team are great. They are accommodating, they're knowledgeable, and they will walk you through this process in a way that will represent your interests as the community. So take advantage of that. Use this opportunity to, as you say, be able to control the vote, control the future, looking at what is in the past.
Awesome.
Can I buy a sign?
Yes, yeah. When we leave here, like I said, I have 10 signs out back. So as soon as we,
Put it in my yard, it's against the HOA.
we can put it by the stop sign.
Contribute.
We can put it by the stop sign, or you, like I said, you can sponsor. If there's a stop sign in the neighborhood or that you drive by every day, you can sponsor a 4-way stop. That's what me and Gina went out and we tried to hit them all, but we're like, man, you want to hear a story about the bread and the fish? Doesn't like Jesus break all the bread and it just keeps multiplying? Me and Gina put out 15 signs out of 40. I count them and there's still 37 in the back. Like, I don't understand. So those signs are back there multiplying. 33 and 48 there is.
Where'd you go to school?
Fairhope High School.
I want to thank Matthew and who did a great job.
Yes, thank you guys.
What you got?
So listen, one final thing, and forgive I'm from Robertsdale, so I don't have quite the eloquence my director has.
Was that a Fairhope joke?
So forgive me.
He's from Iowa.
He's from Iowa.
Right.
Eloquence he has.
Man, nobody's perfect. We got this.
And he's a preacher's kid.
That's true. I've had to educate him on quite a number of things. He's getting there. But Elizabeth, something that your fellow citizens might find interesting, if you've never attended or never seen a planning commission meeting, what they do. So the Baldwin County Planning Commission meeting is this Thursday in Robertsdale at Central Annex in the auditorium on Palmer Street. And I'm not saying that there's anything on the agenda other than you can watch the meeting live on Facebook Live or just show up and attend.
I don't know if I could keep my mouth shut from the back.
But you will see both zoning and subdivision
Right.
cases.
Right.
You'll see examples of both from all over the county. And so it may be very educational to see what we do every day and what the end product is when we go before the planning commission.
And what day is this again?
This is Thursday of this week, which
Okay.
is the 3rd of February. The Fairhope Planning Commission meeting, their next planning commission meeting, I believe, is on the 7th.
Oh, we'll be there.
And so that's a whole different ball game.
Right.
What we do at the county level are things that are approved by our county planning commission. And then, so just to explain that just a little bit very briefly, Gables on Lawrence is one we review at the staff level. But the planning commission that considers that is Fairhope.
Let me just amplify that. There's nothing worse than sitting up there on that commission platform and looking at a group of people who have come to ask for help to be told that they're in an unzoned area and there's nothing we can do, even though we want to. And that sad look on those people's face tell you why zoning is so important, in my opinion, as a member of the planning commission.
Yeah, funny story. When I first decided to get zoning, I sent an email to Baldwin County Zoning, and then like 3 days later, we're on a Zoom call, and I asked Matthew, I didn't even know him at the time, I was like, why does the county want us to be zoned so bad? And he was like, you called me. And he said, but you said, that exact thought. You know, first of all, us being zoned is going to make way more work for them. You know, it makes their lives and jobs harder because now they have all this work to do. But also, time and time again, the citizens call and say, help us, help us, help us. And there's nothing that they can do because they're unzoned. So when we get zoned, you better help us.
Well, it's a toolbox.
A toolbox, that's it.
If you don't have the tool, then it just sits in the toolbox unused.
Right.
But you have to go through a process to get that tool out of the toolbox.
Yeah. Sissy?
I saw where y'all were meeting, this past Tuesday was at the Fairhope Courthouse. Tuesday morning?
Tomorrow morning.
No. This is for the Baldwin County Comprehensive Plan.
Right. When, are y'all done with all those?
So
or-
those got postponed just because there was so much COVID going around. We were worried folks might not come out to the meeting.
Oh, okay.
So they're actually going to be bumped to, they're either going to take place at the end of this month or early next month. And I don't want people to fret about that too much. All zoned areas are part of the comprehensive plan process. It's not a mandatory guide. It's a guide that basically says if zonings come in, rezoning requests come in, where are the areas where growth makes a lot of sense? Where are the areas where growth doesn't make sense because it's rural, agricultural, environmental, different things like that. And it's just a guide to help the planning commission decide as the county grows. And it's a public process. There are public meetings and everything like that.
Okay, but they put those on.
That's right.
So it'll
there'll be several series of those.
Yeah, summer being the hyperlocal.
That's right. Yes, ma'am.
Awesome. Does that wrap it up? Anybody have anything else? All right.
If any of y'all need updates on the Lawrence Road thing, we can talk after.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.